Have you ever not done something that you said you would do? Often we brush it off, it's just something small, right? But if it keeps occurring in our life, if there's a difference or gap between our intention, what we want to do, and our actual action, it's actually very, very useful to look under the surface and see what is going on. You can think of an iceberg. An iceberg, you only see the top of the iceberg, right? Then there's water. But beneath the surface, beneath the water, is this massive iceberg. And that's a good analogy for what we're doing here, which is shadow work. And that's what I talk about in this channel, which is how to look beneath the water at what's actually going on to cause that inaction. Because often we label it as procrastination, but if procrastination keeps occurring, it might be something a bit deeper. So when most people attempt to look at this problem, they do it in a way where they are judging themselves, they're criticizing themselves, they are feeling bad about not taking the action that they wanted to take. For example, they wanted to go to the gym. They didn't go to the gym, they procrastinated on it. And they just beat themselves up. But we know this is not an effective solution. But when you don't know any other solutions, it's an easy one to fall into. To put it simply, most people go about this completely the wrong way, which actually intensifies the internal resistance that they feel. This internal resistance actually makes it harder to follow through with that task. You can think of the analogy of a rubber band. As you stretch the rubber band further and further out, and there's more and more tension, you get to a point where there's so much tension that the rubber band snaps. And that's what it's like for a lot of people. It takes a crisis for them to actually take action. It takes a deadline to actually take that action. For example, there might be an exam or test coming up, but they procrastinate on the study again and again and again until it is pretty late. Now, the interesting thing is, if you ask those people, do you want to take that good action that they know is beneficial for them? Most of them would say, yes, yeah, I want to do it. But something's blocking them, something's stopping them, right? In other words, a part of them wants to go in this direction, a part of them wants to go in this direction. We can call that a split ego state. There's a fracture in the psyche, there's a fracture in consciousness. We often think of ourselves as one singular unit, right? Like I am me, I'm Dylan. We don't realize that we're actually all these little people in this one mind. Part of us wants to go in this direction sometimes. Part of us wants to do this. Part of us wants to do that. Part of us is afraid of speaking in public, but part of us wants to speak in public, right? And sometimes we have these battles where part of us is afraid, but then the part of us that really wants to do it is like, okay, I'm going to take over. I'm just going to speak in public, which is what I'm doing right now. However, we can examine the needs of these parts. The way I like to see it is that the mind isn't the singular CEO, but the mind is comprised of many subparts, and these subparts are like the board of directors. They each have their own desires for the company. They each have a direction that they want to go in. And often they're on the same page. For a company to be very successful, all the board members need to be on the same page to have some cohesive, unified vision. And when people in the company are on the same page, the company does better, the company thrives, right? But sometimes they're not on the same page. And so you can imagine in the company what type of resolution or conflict resolution or strategies you can employ to actually get people on the same page. It's the same with our minds. You don't want to be in crisis mode. You don't want to have all the directors fighting. You want to have the directors unified with a shared vision, a cohesive shared goal or understanding. And that is what we are doing here with this process called parts work. In other words, we can get these board members on the same page. So, to avoid these problems, I'm going to be teaching you exactly how to get to the root of these patterns. And by getting to the root, we see and understand why we behave in the ways that we do. We can actually move forward in a direction without that internal resistance, without that internal pressure, without that internal infighting. Let's say we have two different parts of ourselves, and let's say one part is acting against the best interests of the other part. What often happens is we start to create internal resistance. This internal resistance is created because of the oppositional elements, the oppositional forces that have now been created and pitted against each other. A good analogy is, imagine if you have a rope and the two people on both sides are pulling in different directions, right? Back, forward, back, forward, back, forward. Now, if they are both equally strong, you're not going to go anywhere. But often what happens is, just like a rope fight, you move in one direction and then you move back in the other direction. One direction, the other direction, depending on the strength of the two different sides. And eventually one side wins and you go in that direction by taking that action. And the action could even be not inaction, right? The action could be, relaxing, not doing anything, and maybe you really have to study for that exam.
So, what is this protector part? The part that wants to procrastinate protecting me from? It could be the fear of failure and feeling incompetent, or feeling out of control, the feeling that we don't think we could adequately complete the task. Maybe it's really challenging, difficult, or demanding. And maybe we've worked on tasks in the past that stressed us out or resulted in agitation, stress. And so just thinking about the problem now, the part is trying to protect us from more of that stress.
So a question you want to ask yourself is there a way to satisfy both their needs? Is there a way to meet in the middle? And what would that look like? By understanding the parts of ourselves intimately, we automatically create more compassion for those aspects of ourselves. And by creating more compassion, we learn to act in the best interest of ourselves. So what I'm going to teach is a rapid fire guide to a technique called parts work. And we're going to use parts work to ask deeper questions in order to create more awareness around our problem. Now, I'm going to be teaching this in more of a generic fashion. So what you want to do is you want to tailor it to your current problem and individualize it for you. So use these questions and use these steps as guidelines to help dive further into awareness. Use these as guidelines and principles, not something that's set in stone.
The first step is to identify the struggle. And what we want to do here is pinpoint what's happening that feels difficult or emotional or conflicted. And we can facilitate this by asking ourselves a few questions. Like, what am I trying to figure out or make a decision about? Where am I not taking action? What situation left me feeling off, reactive, or confused? Where in my life do I feel stuck, overwhelmed, or like I'm fighting myself? And is there a repeated pattern or conflict that keeps showing up? We want to zoom in on a specific moment. And step 2 is to notice the different parts involved. The goal here is to identify the internal voices or sub-personalities that are active. Some questions you can ask yourself include: what are the different thoughts, feelings, or impulses I'm experiencing? You could say something like, a part of me feels like this, and a part of me feels like that. A part of me feels angry, and another part of me feels sad. You can then ask yourself, who's loudest in the room? in the moment. If you can imagine all these parts in a room, who's loudest? And is there another quieter part that you might not be aware of? Who's in the room? A quieter part that you've suppressed? And finally, what are the shoulds, fears, or desires that are coming from different angles? So we want to become very aware of the different parts and what they're saying. We can even give the parts a name or visualize it as an image. It could be the people pleaser or the inner critic or a protector part. We're just being aware and becoming more intimate with it. Step 3 is to turn towards one part at a time. The goal here is to focus on one part and to get to know it deeply. You can ask yourself, what are you trying to do for me? What are you afraid would happen if you didn't act this way? How long have you been doing this job? What do you believe about the world or about me? How do you feel about the other parts? For example, the inner critic might be desiring perfection, and that inner critic might have aversion to the part that just wants to express without judgment. And finally, do you remember the first time you started acting in this way? This helps you go into the past and see how these parts played out in your life. And in this process, maybe some judgments come up for you. And so in step 4, what we want to do is offer compassion and curiosity. So the goal here is to shift from judgment to understanding and connection. And we do that by seeing how it has tried to protect you.
Because we're getting something out of it, right? But often we don't realize that. We see the oppositional force as an enemy. But it's there for a reason. And when we can realize that it's there for a reason, we switch our mindset, we switch our approach from a harsh, criticizing approach to realizing that there's actually part of us that wants to get something. And the part of us that wants to get something is trying to get that thing for a good reason. So, the simple switch in mindset changes everything. You start by asking the question, what am I getting by not taking this action? When you ask that question, the oppositional force will start to reveal itself to you. So by asking this question, you start to examine the internal forces. And the oppositional force, which feels like it's pitted against you or is in criticism of you, we'll start to see that it'll come to light. This is the part of you that does not want to take that action. And we're starting to become intimate with it by being open to it, by not criticizing, judging, or condemning it, but by being warmly open, being the unconditional loving witness. For example, the other day I was taking a long shower and it took me a long time to get out. In the past, I might have just brushed this off, right? Just thinking, I'm procrastinating. But because of this change in how I view things now, I realized that I was actually getting something out of being in the shower. I was getting warmth, comfort, relaxation. I was feeling like I didn't have to do anything, like I didn't have to do all these tasks and pressure myself with a never-ending to-do list. By examining that, I started to realize that a part of me really needed rest, and really desired it. This small but subtle change changes your relationship with you, because ultimately you aren't just one person, you are comprised of many, many subparts. And when we can be intimate with these subparts, when we can understand their needs, their desires, and how they impact us, we stop fighting internally, and the internal battle dies down as we start to integrate back into this cohesive whole?
Can I see this part as trying to help or protect me in some way? And what emotions do I feel towards this part? Do I feel some judgment, or annoyance, or sympathy? Can I shift into a more compassionate stance, even just a little? And what would you say to a child or friend who felt this way? And during this step, we just want to give this part a lot of love, a lot of care, a lot of understanding, because you're seeing how this part served you. You're seeing and understanding that this part was here for a reason, and it served you in some way, some really beneficial way. And the next step is just to ask what the part needs, because every part wants something, and our goal is just to understand what it's truly desiring beyond behavior that's playing out. So you can ask yourself, what are you really needing from me right now? What would help you feel less afraid, angry, or overwhelmed? Is there something you've been trying to get for a long time? If you didn't have to protect me, what would you want to do instead? Is there something you want me to know or do? And as we're doing this step, we're seeing how it plays out and interacts with the rest of us. The next step is to have the conflicting parts of us come into a agreement, because before a part can relax and integrate, it needs to agree with the part it's conflicting with, right? Kind of like a peace treaty. This isn't about forcing it to change, it's about negotiating with respect, showing the part that it no longer has to act out in the old ways because someone trustworthy, which is you, is finally here. So what we're doing here is we're negotiating. And by negotiating, you're creating new roles or agreements for these parts. You're not just hearing the part, you're now helping the part to shift. In this step, you can ask yourself, what does this part need in order to trust me? What would help this part feel safe enough to step back from its role? Are there any other parts, like inner critics or protectors, that need to be included in this conversation? And can we come to a new agreement together? What would this agreement look like? Now that the trust has been built, the part no longer feels it needs to act out, protect, or hide. It no longer sees itself as separate or in charge. It lets go of its extreme roles and rigid beliefs. It accepts your leadership. It often transforms. For example, an angry protector might become a boundary setter, or scared inner child might become playful again. It rejoins your full sense of self, like energy that's been splintered now coming home. This isn't just a conversation anymore, it's a shift in identity. You feel different because you are different, more whole.
So if you are procrastinating, it's probably not that you are lazy, it's probably that parts within you are in conflict. One part of you wants to get something done, another part is trying to protect you from something, or it's desiring something else. Parts work isn't about fixing yourself. It's about listening to what's already happening inside. If you're stuck in procrastination, that stuckness is actually intelligent. There's part of you that's trying to help, even if in a twisted way. And when you build a relationship with it, you stop fighting yourself and start moving forward with clarity and inner support. And once this part feels safe, it doesn't have to hijack your behavior anymore. That's where integration happens. You're not forcing yourself to push through. You're aligned. And that's the motivation that actually lasts.